Okay, I'm so excited to be closing today, not only because I imagine that you all are really excited that we're closing today, but because I think that my talk weaves together a lot of the conversations that we've been having through Q&A today about representationality and power, and I hope that that can lead us into an exciting conversation as we close. So my talk today is called Digital Flânerie Towards a Humanistic Mapping Methodology. It's a bit of a thought experiment. So I want to think about how historians of American literature, like myself, might think about how our work, primarily about the national or even about the local, might operate on the scale of the global. Namely, how we Americanists and the Americanists, or the Americans that we study, take up space in a global field. On a different level, I want to think a little bit about how data is structured, organized, and cleaned, these processes that we've been talking about today, and how that process of standardization may, in fact, replicate the very ideologies that the humanities should be contesting. To think about these things, I'm going to use an example from my own work, a digital map of literary Paris as told by American expatriate authors across the 20th century called Digital Flânerie, made in collaboration with colleagues of mine in the English department. So I do want to flag right up front that I'm aware that I'm talking about Americans going to Paris, so this is just like one empire visiting another. But I think that some of these examples can be instructive, and I hope that at least these principles might carry over and again speak to the conversation we've had today. So DH scholars and skeptics alike, and all of us here today, have addressed the disciplinary friction that arises and often remains unremarked upon when working as a humanist and with humanistic data in highly empirical environments. So take digital maps like this one. While many mapping platforms purport to be self-evident mimetic reflections of the world, they are in fact representations and constructions of the world. As with any representation, maps are ideologically structured, inheriting and replicating the colonial and imperialist histories of mapmaking. So not only, of course, am I discussing this highly problematic Eurocentric Mercator map projection, in which you can see like the country of Greenland is larger than the entire continent of Africa, but I'm also speaking of the ways in which maps and the process of making maps effectively name places, often rejecting local dialects or tribal languages in favor of the language of the empire. So Johanna Drucker has argued that an appropriate and necessary incorporation of critical theory in DH involves, quote, introducing parallax and difference, thus taking apart any possible claim to the self-evident or self-identical presentation of knowledge and replacing this with a recognition of the madeness and constructedness that inhere in any representation of knowledge, end quote. So in the context of global DH, incorporating difference does not simply reflect a more humanistic methodology. Rather, intentionally attending to difference can work as a corrective, limiting the replication of imperialist practices through an emphasis on local discourses, spatial constructions, and languages. So I want to discuss one way that my research team, tried to address these differences through the way in which we cleaned, or rather left messy, some of our data. I'll go back here. So we've mapped the locations from 32 texts of American expatriate literature from across the 20th century. So we extracted each of these locations and assembled our data by hand. So we did not rely on any machine reading practices. There were 4 of us, 32 texts. We figured we could each take 8 books and it wouldn't totally kill us. As we cleaned up our database, we ran into a problem that perhaps we should have expected, and maybe you did, and that is that Ernest Hemingway is really bad at French, like really bad. And this problem was not unique to Hemingway at all. So here, you can see this example of what cleaning our data looked like in OpenRefine. You can see that this is precisely a problem of not knowing the language. So here you can see the 4 different ways of spelling Champs-Élysées. Questions of whether you need an accent grave or an accent aigu, or whether you need a circumflex, or you can just write it without any attention to that. Thanks, Sean. This is a linguistic problem, and it's not necessarily a major one, but oftentimes these differences weren't really about any particular author's mastery of French, but their experience of a place. For instance, You can consider all of these ways in which authors refer to the Luxembourg Gardens, all of these ways in which they're choosing to represent their experience in their space or their relationship to this park that they lived nearby, that they inhabited daily. Our team spent a long time discussing how to face this challenge. When French words were spelled incorrectly, the answer seemed simple enough, but when authors referred to the same place by a different name, should we standardize, choose a proper or a correct name for these contested spaces? And most importantly, what are the ethical and political implications of doing so? So cleaning up our data isn't really up for debate. In fact, it's often the bulk of the work that we do. So the way that the programming historian, for instance, describes this process is by saying, as we increasingly share, aggregate, and reuse data on the web, historians will need to respond to data quality issues, which inevitably pop up. And if that feels kind of too large, you can also think about Christoph Skok's description of smart data, in which he says smart data is clean in the sense that imperfections of the process of capture or creation have been reduced as much as possible within the limits of the specific aspect of the original object being represented. That is to say, the sort of difference that my team confronted, issues of language, yes, but also issues of experience, are considered to be issues of quality, errors, and imperfections. They're bugs, they're not features. And I think that's a problem. So even in this instance, we're talking about, again, one powerful nation occupying another very powerful nation. I think that the example is instructive and the provocation might transfer. Here I think we can really see the rub between the empirical, the positivistic, the standardized on the one hand, and our understanding of literary space as imagined, rooted in lived experience and non-exclusive. We can also see, I think, the ways in which our methods might unwittingly participate in, rather than challenge, the imperialist and colonialist tendencies of mapmaking. So our team tried to address this in a few ways. First, we kind of let our data stay a little messy. We did not standardize place names, but we relied on the language of the original text in order to emphasize that space is not self-evident, but is highly mediated and contested. So I'll show you really quickly to go back to this Luxembourg Garden issue. Here it is on our map. And one of the things that we wanted to emphasize here was all of the different ways in which people are describing it, right? So just in our first three, this is probably too small for you to see, but we can see that Ernest Hemingway calls it the Luxembourg Gardens. Oh, I missed one. He calls it the Little Luxembourg. Henry James calls it the Luxembourg Gardens. And gradually those things change. You can see it was used quite frequently across our corpus. Second, in order to really emphasize that this was intentional rather than an error, we included the extracted quote on the map, so it became clear that these names were produced intentionally, sort of a sic erat scriptum to the map. So I think back to that issue of making our choices transparent and the fact that we have made choices, we wanted to include the original text on the map as much as possible. And to show that we were not trying to be overly prescriptive about the shape our data took, that we were letting these texts speak for themselves. Again, it was important that we allow the space for this linguistic difference and make it clear that this is, in fact, a feature, data that's been left intentionally messy, instead of the bug that we often think of it as. So I hope what I've done in this race to the finish line of a talk, in some ways, is leaning into the sort of disciplinary friction that arises here. My hope is that through, rather than blindly or blithely accepting our tools, we might readily kind of begin to challenge and problematize them, particularly as we think about how we as Americans, or I as an Americanist, might operate on a global scale. So thanks.